Hello and welcome to this new episode of Bootstrapping Your Dreams Show. I'm your host Manoj Agarwal, and today we'll be talking to Christopher Coyle. So, Christopher is the founder and CEO of TAO, which is Tethra Advisors and Officers. TAO is an emerging tech, circular economy, and data analytics consultancy, which Chris founded in 2020. Christopher is an accomplished executive with over 20 years of diverse cross functional experience spanning multiple industries. Chris currently is a consultant, advisor, mentor for organizations such as Newchip Accelerator, which is the number one online accelerator program with a global reach. Spectronn, where he handles global strategy, business development, and partnerships, and Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where Chris serves as a business mentor. Chris is a member of both United Nations Decade of Ocean Sciences, Arctic Ocean Action Plan Group, and the US National Delegation to the UN's Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. He was requested to give testimony on May 8th, 2018, in Washington, D.C., before the US Congressional House Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure regarding the Coast Guard's use of blue technology to increase efficiency, performance, duration, and cost, which President Trump signed into law on October 11th, 2018. Chris has a wealth of experience in licensing intellectual property and content for use on a variety of media platforms supported by different business models around the world. Uh, Clients like Comcast, NBC, Universal Music, Sony, Warner Brothers, Walt Disney, Viacom, CBS, Verizon. Uh, these are some of the names which are included in the roster of clients that Chris has served. He takes great pride in constantly pushing himself to learn about cutting edge technologies and altering user behavior. Chris has served in various executive management roles for 18 years, exceeding revenue targets, fostering growth through business development, strategic alliances, public offerings of two companies, mobile streams on AIM and MCY Music World on NASDAQ, as the sale of Muse to Macrovision, which was acquired by TiVo and then later by Rovi. Wow, Chris, you have done so much. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
A pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on.
Awesome. So, I know you have a very, like a very colorful background. You've been in music industry, and then now you're doing things in technology, and you're raising awareness about the oceans and green economy. So, can you help us get to know you better? Like, what is your background? How did you arrive at this point? Take us down the memory lane.
Sure. Thank you very much. As you mentioned earlier, I spent the better part of 20 plus years in music entertainment media space doing sales and marketing and business development, and helped take two companies public and sold a third. And then in 2017, not looking to pivot my career, I was contacted by a fellow alumni and asked to do a consulting project, which I thought was short term, for an X Prize that they had been a semifinalist in mapping the ocean seafloor. I didn't know anything about the maritime industry, didn't know anything about underwater autonomous vehicles, but really fell in love with it, and became not only a pivot for my career, but passion in my life, and been very fortunate in this opportunity. It's probably not a natural traditional career pivot to go from the music industry into the maritime space. But what I quickly found is that, well, that non-traditional background has become quite advantageous in terms of trying to bring in investors, and that's angel through sovereign wealth, as well as big tech companies in terms of data capture, cybersecurity. It's, maritime industry has been as old as man has been walking Earth, and has been operating in very much a similar way since World War II, and is ripe for transformation. So that background has been super helpful in terms of trying to transform the industry and work with universities and research institutions, Congress. I work with a number of government agencies in the White House, but then also get to communicate with folks at the World Bank and EU and NATO, and everything in between. So it's been it's been my MBA +++ the last 5 years, and really been fascinating to understand, an industry that is several $trillion a year to global GDP. Employs 20 million plus folks around the world. We can't get to climate change mitigation unless we have healthy oceans. Every other breath that people take comes from our seas. More and more folks get their protein sources from our oceans. 95% of all goods and energy are put on the back of a boat and sailed around the world. So vitally important to not only national security, but economic prosperity, workforce development. There's massive opportunities for STEM and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And my view is if we do a better job, and I certainly think we can, there should be more than enough capital attracted into the vertical to tackle the sustainability issues that affect everyone. It's been a real honor in my life to be able to play a kind of pivotal role in trying to transform this industry, and do it both on a national and international level, but then also work with a number of innovation and accelerator programs, working with emerging tech and the blue economy. I work with a group up in Boston, work with another one in Newport, Rhode Island, one down in Wilmington, North Carolina, another one in Miami. The one in Austin that you mentioned earlier, Newchip, is the newest edition. Work with another group in San Diego. I've done some work with a couple accelerators in Canada, and I actually just found out yesterday that I was certified as the first American advisor and coach to the European Union's Blue Invest Fund, which is looking to accelerate the adoption investment in blue tech and blue economy in Europe. So it's I get to have impact there as well. So it's been a lot of
awesome. That's great. It seems like you're doing some impactful work, and I just want to take note of the fact that you came from a different industry, and you are excelling in a very different industry. So one thing that jumps out at me is, like, once you find your passion, the skills that you have accumulated over lifetime, they can be applied anywhere, as long as you find purpose and you're passionate about that field, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because my first career, which was the entertainment industry, I tripped into. I'm from New York, but I grew up in Delaware and have actually known the president's family since I was a freshman in high school. I was a year ahead of his oldest son and used to play soccer and tennis against Bo, who unfortunately passed away from cancer a few years ago. But we went to two competing Catholic schools, and so I got involved in politics early. I worked for Lieutenant Governor of Delaware, worked on another U.S. Senate campaign from Delaware, got a degree in political science, and thought that I was going to go to law school and do international law. And then I was asked to do some concert promotion and realized that was a whole lot more fun, and I didn't have to look for work every 4 years based on my political affiliation. Little did I know that I couldn't have picked a more unstable industry to go into, but a lot of fun. And my view at the time, I came out of school in 1990, and we were going into Desert Storm 1, massive economic collapse at the time. And so I went back to grad school, and I remember coming home to tell my parents that I wasn't going to do international affairs, that I was going to the entertainment industry. And my parents, I think, were serious, but I kind of laugh at it now. But they want to know if I wanted to go see the family priest or a counselor, because what was I possibly thinking? In their mind, Lawrence Welk was the only entertainment. Nobody could make a career, and certainly nobody from Delaware. But I thought that I could do more in an impactful way with the entertainment industry, because they were able to tackle subject matters that both politics and religion kind of didn't want to hit the third rail, where entertainment could discuss these matters. And for me, this is kind of full circle, because I get to use my background in political science and my MBA and work to really make a difference. It was a lot of fun in the music industry, but I'm not really sure I made the world a better place. Maybe gave some enjoyment from an album that people related to or a concert that they went to. But now with a 9-year-old son, I get to hopefully work with his generation and trying to improve and leave the planet a better place for him. I actually have a board meeting later on after this podcast with the school district here in Connecticut on integrating emerging technology for the kids and for teachers and administrators and parents to really prepare them for jobs of the future that don't exist. So I try to give back, not only to my community, but certainly as it relates to cybersecurity and some of the other clients that I'm working with now that are tracking space debris. I get to serve our country, and I don't have to put on a uniform. I get to do it in my own unique way. So
that's awesome. Yeah, so I'm pretty sure, the music is the food for the soul. So I'm pretty sure you did make the world a better place with that as well. Now, for a lot of people who don't understand what a circular economy is, can you shed a little bit of light on that term?
Sure. The idea is, how do we manufacture, improve efficiency in our supply chain, which obviously has become, a major global issue during the pandemic. How do we make sure that we are smarter in how we extract, how we manufacture, and how those things can possibly be reused or recycled or reclaimed, and do that in an efficient way? Obviously, businesses are in the business of making money for their shareholders and for the company. And so trying to balance that, I have found some success trying to use a business case analysis in how I approach my conversations in terms of blue tech and blue economy development. And that seems to resonate. Obviously, when I'm talking to the UN or the World Bank, I just reverse the order of the argument, but it's the same kind of business case analysis. Why do those institutions need to care about what's going on? Why do citizens need to care? Why do we need to invest in mitigating? And how do we use technology to accomplish that? I don't deal with the investors in tech community and streaming and downloads like I used to for 20 some years in the music industry. Now it's IoT, machine learning, and AI, and cloud computing, and edge computing. And it certainly can't solve everything, but I think it can accelerate a better understanding and solving some of these issues. And so, having that background has been hugely helpful, I think, to the industry. That for the most part, these folks, have spent most of their career either, trying to acquire PhDs or working in a research lab. That doesn't lend to having a Rolodex of venture capital and private equity and tech companies. And so, I'm not an oceanographer. I don't claim to be, a meteorologist. I do get to bring that skill set into the conversation to create kind of a baseline understanding, and then hopefully those folks can go back and evangelize within their companies and within their own industries on, applying lessons learned in the transformation the automotive industry, did in 2008, or the aerospace industry did, 20 plus years ago. I think there's a lot of lessons that can be transferred, certainly personally, but then also from a technical perspective into the maritime space that's desperately needed.
Of course. No, that's a great point about the circular economy. Like we gotta be more cautious and have ways to reduce our footprint on the environment. But that's also good for the planet. But can you tell us how is it commercially beneficial as well? Because from what I'm hearing and seeing, the green economy is going to be actually becoming a major part of economy very soon, and there are many commercial opportunities out there for people who want to get involved, not only with the oceans but the forests and clean air and whatnot. So since you are in the thick of things, can you share with us what do you see as the commercial scope of these industries?
Yeah, it's funny. There's a camp that was involved in trying to slow down whether or not climate change even exists in our country, or where other parts of the world believe the science and invested accordingly. We here in the U.S. Certainly did not, and you see a lot of that same kind of camp trying to dig in against ESG and corporate social responsibility and impact investment. That boat has sailed. I think the smart money, for oil and gas companies is they're transitioning into energy companies, and they're looking at the totality of wave, wind, solar. And so I think there's an enormous opportunity in terms of that transformation in a number of industries, whether it's clean hydrogen for the shipping industry. That's going to take time, and there's no silver bullet to get from where we are today, fossil fuel into completely, entirely renewable energy by 2050 without bumps and bruises and iterations. And that's, something that I've learned within the startup space. There is no silver bullet. You've got to plan accordingly. If the market doesn't react or the product doesn't resolve the problem, you've got to pivot and you've got to get back to the drawing board and start again. There is an enormous amount of money to be made from this, jobs to be created, companies to be staffed, new innovations to be created. Progress is the only thing, and change is the only thing that I know that is inevitable. I think everyone recognizes the challenges that we have. We have one planet. I'm all for space exploration and space investment, but I think the maritime industry has not been as effective in terms of public opinion and capital policy development that the space industry is clearly. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. NASA and NOAA are about the same age in the U.S., about 50 years old. But NASA's done, in my mind, a much more effective job in raising awareness, capital, and funding. And then 10 years ago, they pivoted and are now really focused on the research and development, and private industry and investors are coming in. And now that's a private industry. And I think the maritime industry can learn a lot from that. There's a lot of innovative programs going on now with the Department of Energy in trying to transform our power system, our grid. It's one thing to say that we need to get to renewable energy, but there are impediments like the Jones Act, which require shipbuilding to be done in U.S. territory. We offshored a lot of that decades ago, and so now we've got to bring that back. Integrating offshore wind into the electrical grid, is not just simply a plug and play. There's got to be development for that. So I think there are a lot of opportunities throughout the ecosystem, and I think we need to do a better job of explaining to both citizens as well as industry and companies. We've got to energize them. We've got to inspire them. And at the end, we've got to, what's in it for them? You've got to prove out why, if you're the only company who's taking on this additional cost, that puts you at a disadvantage against your competitors. So, I think one thing that we've learned, and at least I feel that we as a planet have learned during COVID, is that we are capable of tackling these global challenges. For a long time, that can got kicked down the road as long as we could. And when push came to shove, we collectively as a planet got together and brought a vaccination to market in a fraction of the time that it was originally projected. Because I remember, initially they were saying maybe 2.5 years, and it was months. So I think, the idea of collaborating and communicating and coordinating is vitally important. And there's a lot of great initiatives in the maritime space and a lot of great efforts in green tech and blue tech and gray tech. And I think all of those are coming together. But we've got to do a better job of informing, the work that's being done at World Economic Forum and the World Bank and the UN Global Compact, along with what's being done in Canada and the US and Europe. Often that's being done in a vacuum or in a silo, and there's just not enough resources for us to continue that. We got to work together. Not one company or one country has got the solution to solve all of this. Collaboratively, I think we can certainly accelerate and do a much better job than what we're doing. But that involves working together, and I think the COVID vaccine is one of those areas. Although it's not been uniformly applied everywhere, I think there's hope and progress and promise of trying to tackle some of these other challenges that we've avoided dealing with because they've been too large. I think we're capable of handling much more than we are, and I think part of that just comes from background as an entrepreneur. You know what you know, and you try to avoid what you don't know, and until you get into these things and figure out, I am capable of more. I am smarter than I give myself credit for. I've got more grit, or I can add more value to an organization. Getting out of your comfort zone, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point that you mentioned. Getting out of your comfort zone, that's where the growth happens, not only for individuals, but as you said, like as a species, as a whole, as a country, or any kind of group of people. So definitely we need to take those actions. Now, as you were describing this, one thought came to my mind again. Since you have a unique vantage point, you're working with international organizations. One thing I always hear is that not every country has the same amount of resources to invest in these initiatives. Moreover, a lot of the developing countries, they argue that most of these problems were created by developed countries, and now they are off to the races, and now the developing countries have to burn fossil fuels and whatnot to catch up. So what are your views around those kind of things? Like, how can we smoothen these divides between countries and different parts of the world in terms
Sure.
of their resources and their motivation to do something about it?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious and clear. The biggest polluters in the world are the industrialized nations, and U.S. and China being two of the biggest. We have an obligation because those countries that are developing are often the most impacted by sea level rising and climate change. You're seeing the severity and the occurrence rate through these massive storms around the world accelerate, and the cost skyrocket. I mean, just Hurricane Ian, the amount of damage just done in Florida, some numbers are as high as $45 billion. And that was, a relatively mild, now, not for the people in Florida, certainly not Sanibel Island, but a mild hurricane. I mean, we've had much greater strengths, and the impact on insurance companies, on financial services, on supply chain is exorbitant. The one benefit I think I've had in trying to communicate with all of these different stakeholder groups is, when you work in a startup company, I've kind of always been at the cross section of content, technology, and finance. And even when you're working for the same company and you're all speaking the same language, you're often talking above and below each other because the vernaculars that people use, the other community has no idea what you're talking about. And often that's done at their disadvantage. So I think being able to understand what each of those communities bring, what they suffer directly is key. And when I started talking with the White House in 2020, not long before COVID shut everything down, I always had the idea that, we've got to include the EU, we've got to include NATO, we've got to include the World Bank, we've got to include IFC. Because if we only focus on one segment, one country, one population, we are putting another at a massive disadvantage. And I believe, the best way is to raise all boats at the same time. That's difficult. And I think you have to be able to have a macro and a micro viewpoint. And I sit in that. And the one advantage is I get to say things that other people think, but they don't want to ruin their tenure or their military rank or their next election cycle. I don't care. I think it's too important not to have these conversations, and they're difficult. I also believe, and I know that I've certainly got pushback from my friends in the environmental movement, but I don't know how we get to energy independence without oil and gas companies. Mm-hmm. I think they need to be held accountable, but it's not my job to wag the finger, and I think there are plenty of other people to do that. But their engineering and process and procedure and manufacturing capability is bar none. We can't launch significant offshore wind fields without that experience, and so they need to be in the room. Same reason I think foundations need to be in the room. I think they can be much more strategic. I'm not always sure their intentions certainly are in the right direction, but a lot of it is often to raise capital to do additional fundraising efforts and to pay significant corporate salaries, and very little money is actually going to the problem. And when you change that paradigm, you often take those philanthropies and foundations out of the mix. And so they're part of both the problem and the solution. What Congress does is both part of the problem and part of the solution. And so it's much more, I think, impactful to incentivize folks and understand why it's relevant for them to care. And if they don't, it's very difficult. In 2016, we had a great dialogue in the US about the coal industry. And when you look at the dollar impact on GDP and the number of jobs, it's small. But there are 45,000 families around the US that make a living. And you're impacting how they pay for rent or their mortgage or send their kids to school or healthcare. We miss that. If you want those folks to transition into renewable energy, well, we've got to give them a pathway. So I think there's a smarter way to go do that. All of these things need to be discussed in earnest, but I think we often miss, there are lives. There are people that are impacted in these decisions and transition, which is, part of, making sure that generational fisher families, as migratory acceleration happens with a lot of fish stock, and we get out of boats and we go to a more autonomous and offshore aquaculture. How do we make sure that those families are taken care of and are part of that transition and are skilled to make that transition? You can't just cut it off. 20 years ago in 2000, I was at the crossroad when the music industry went from an analog world to a digital world. And I saw firsthand, because I was there, with one of the first online music companies that we took public, people that were in that traditional old school world, careers ended, companies cratered, tens of billions of dollars left the marketplace. And it took probably 18 years before there was parity between digital and analog. And now obviously digital is driving the train. I don't want to make that same mistake. We need scientists and research folks and people in the military that have dedicated their lives to making sure we know that we're safe as part of that transition, because their brain trust is vitally important in that transition. And we can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I think in that entertainment transition, there was a lot for us to learn. And I had a lot of friends, that went into real estate or went into selling insurance and will never work in that industry again because it changed. And so I think it's important that we bring those folks along in that transition and listen. because their lives, their careers, their professions, their families are impacted in that transition.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, one question I always like to ask is what role your mentors and coaches played in your life, because having achieved this level of success, I believe nobody can do it alone. So uh, please do tell us a little bit about maybe any stories that you may share, any experiences you had where you were really impacted by your mentors.
So I think for most people, the two biggest mentors in their lives are their mother and their father. My dad was an Air Force pilot, and then went into state government after that, and now as a father myself, I think like most boys, that rebel against their parents or the ways that they're brought up. I now realize, had I listened to my father 45 years ago, my life would have been. And,
Yeah,
and he told me that every day, that if I listened
yeah.
to him, and I should have. I hope to impart that with my son now. So first and foremost, I learned, work ethic for them. I think the second most impactful mentor, although I don't think I've ever used that term in any conversation. When I was a freshman in college, I went to a Jesuit Catholic university, and you were required to do 2 years of a language, foreign language, and I struggled. Thank God my son started learning Chinese in kindergarten and is now learning Spanish, and so at that age you're a sponge. At 16 you're learning about cars and girls.
Yeah,
Learning a foreign language is too late to learn that then.
yeah.
So I struggled, and I went into my last semester into an exam with a D, and I only needed a D to get the credit and finish the requirement. And I remember going to my professor. I was super nervous. I'm like, my parents are going to kill me if I get a D in this class, but if I get a D, at least I finished the requirement and I can go on with the rest of my my core classes. And she's like, "Nah, Chris, you're fine." Well, long story short, I must have bombed the exam. I ended up failing the class, and I remember, panicking. I'm one of six, and so my parents, didn't want to incur any additional costs with any more classwork because I couldn't master French, and I went into the advisement office before the fall semester started, and I went back to an advisor that I was friendly with, and I asked us, "Look, if any help can be just to get the D, then I can finish and move on." And he said, "Chris, I think we can be able to go do that." So he went to talk to another advisor, and they agreed, and then they went to the dean of the advisement office, Dr. Marshall. And I remember, I will never forget his name because it was probably one of the most embarrassing moments in my life. So they went in, they explained, and I remember him getting very vocal in his office, and I was sitting with probably 25 other college students that were trying to figure out their schedule, and some had their parents with them. And he walked out in this room and was like, "Under no circumstances am I changing his grade. And I'm not going to let him audit a course. He's going to have to repeat an entire year. And he can't handle the schoolwork that he's got right now. I'm not sure if he's coming back." And I wanted to crawl underneath the chair. It was super embarrassing. Long story short, that embarrassment put me on the dean's list for the next 6 semesters.
Nice.
And then I stayed at that same university and got my MBA. And when I got my MBA, as I was walking across the stage getting my diploma, Dean Marshall was still at the school and was sitting on the dais. And so I walked over and I said, "Thank you." And I said, "I don't know if you remember me." And he's like, "No, Chris, I remember you." At the time, I had hair down to my behind, and I was probably one of the few kids on campus that had even shoulder length hair. So I kind of stood out. And I said, I have to thank you because that embarrassment drove me as a student. I knew that I could handle the workload. I knew that I belonged at that university. And And oddly enough, I probably spent more time in the library my first year, and it did not pay off, than I did the last 3 years. I remember my father saying, "Well, if it's not broke, don't fix it." So, like anything, you figure out the system, and so I have Dean Marshall to thank for driving me to get on Dean's list and then go and get my MBA. And then I certainly had mentors that took me under their wings when I was in the music industry, and then I've been very grateful for a number of folks in the maritime industry. Craig McLean, who was assistant administrator, NOAA, Admiral John White, who ran the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, was a rear admiral. There have been a number of folks who have really, Mark Abbott, who was the president of Woods Hole up on Cape Cod, really visionary folks within their verticals within the maritime industry. I don't know how to charity pity, helped bring me along. And I think people that have spent most of their career in this space are amazed at, in a short period of time, the network that I've created. But I think when you've spent your entire life in business development, strategic partnerships, and sales, whether you're in a grocery line or on an airplane or at your son or daughter's soccer game, I'm always thinking about what those relationships are, and maybe there is no value beyond social or something collegial. And 10 years later, your industry changes, your career changes, a pivot, and all of a sudden you can go back and say, "Oh, wait, I know Mike that works at that company." And so I'm always, in my view, life is kind of like a puzzle, and so I'm always trying to put those pieces together. And I also don't know who I should talk to and who I shouldn't. I don't. I'm not very good at that. If I think that there's something that you bring to my work or to solving a problem or making a difference in the world, then I try to bring you into my universe, because we all need help. We need help in our lives. We need help in our careers. We need help in our companies and making a difference. And so it's always good when you have people that are supportive of your efforts and inspire you and drive you. That's key. You're absolutely correct. It's funny. I had one of the companies that I was involved in taking public. The CEO was probably 10 years younger than me, and really a super smart person, and was involved in early days. I think was involved actually in the first text message that was sent by Vodafone. And he registered a company called ringtones.com in the late 90s, when people were just wrapping their head around what's the internet, let alone what is a ringtone. That didn't rear its ugly head for another 5 years. And I mentioned the word luck, and he was like, "Oh, no, luck has nothing to do with it." I would disagree. I've been very fortunate in my life to be at the right place at the right time, and somebody opened up a door. And so I work with our alumni association. I work with entrepreneurs because I think if I can shed any light, if I can help them avert some of the growing pains. Everyone who starts out their first job out of college does grunt work, and nobody goes directly to the C-level suite. But if I can shorten that time that you're getting coffee and being humiliated along your career path, I think that's a great place to be in. So I like working with young people, and hopefully they learn lessons that I didn't learn from my dad.
Yeah.
Hopefully they listen and take it to heart.
Absolutely. These are great stories. And as you said, sometimes, the embarrassment that you experience or the pain you experience it becomes the power to do something great. And just building that network and just connecting with people, it takes you a long way. I mean, I had to learn that lesson very late in my life, but I learned it. So great. Thank you so much, Chris, for being here, sharing your wisdom, sharing your knowledge, sharing your passion for the oceans. Now, before I let you go, Can you tell us if people want to connect with you, what is the best way to connect with you?
Sure. I'm on social media. You can certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn. I spend a great deal of my day every day on LinkedIn. I think it's one of the great social media platforms. Send an invite. Happy to engage. Thank you very much for having me. There's been an esteemed list of previous guests, and so I'm very honored to be included in the mix.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll
Thank
put that
you.
link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.